Peter, good to see you again. I actually was looked up when we spoke initially. It was December 5th of last year.
Really, that long ago? Okay. Yeah, it's been a crazy year.
Yeah, you know what? And we were just talking offline. It doesn't feel like Christmas to me. You?
hmm Well, yeah, no, exactly. There's just so much happening that it doesn't feel like that typical, okay, time to unwind and enjoy a little peace and quiet with the family. It's like how can you relax when every day there's a new potential black swan news story, right? So it's great if you've got attention deficit disorder and need that constant stimulus, but yeah, it doesn't feel like the holidays, that normal holidays anyway.
No, and even I'm in Arizona, and I ask people this just when I'm out in public, and I have not got one person says yeah it feels like Christmas, and I thought well. It's warmer here right now. It's 70, 75. It's going to be close to 80 next week. And I attributed it to maybe the weather. But even like my mother lives in Northeast Ohio, and I think it's like 28 degrees there today, and they were getting snow, and it was like 18, I think, yesterday.
Yeah.
like,
Oh, yeah. Well, last week, I'm in Calgary, of course, in the infamous Canadian winter. Normally, this time of year, we're sitting here at minus 30 Celsius. Our weather was actually warmer than Tampa Bay, Florida. So, go figure. We had some weird inversion, heat spike for about a week, and now we're back to kind of a little more colder weather, but nothing like we're typically exposed to in mid-December, where we always get snow, and basically all the snow we had is pretty much melted from last week. So
wow. But even talking to people that are getting the snow and the colder weather, they say the same thing. It doesn't feel like the holidays.
yeah, as I said, if it to me that just strikes me as everyone's got a lot of stress. Everyone's got concerns about bills, and what am I going to do about mortgage? And it's like it's hard to relax. And yeah, no, it doesn't. And yeah, like typically this time of year, my family travels to get together, and just don't have the time and the money to do it this year. So we're all spending Christmas at our own houses. So
Wow. Yeah, I thought when Donald Trump got elected president, this was going to fix everything.
yeah, well, you could argue, well, he hasn't got into power yet. That's one issue about it, and you can see the psychological impact. I mean, he's been acting as if he already is acting president. Going to meet state leaders, making proclamations on how things should be. Telling Putin, "Hey, let's get our peace treaty." He's not in power yet, and meanwhile, you've got the Biden administration doing things which some people say are undercutting, beyond the usual pardon season. Biden's making record number of pardons, and supposedly auctioning off border wall components in Texas, but there's there's so much noise here. It's like, yeah, who's running the show? And yeah, like, are we all together in this now that the Trump campaign would say, yeah, we got a mandate, and it looked initially like, yeah, they had a pretty strong mandate, and now of course the popular vote, after all the late votes have been counted, they don't quite have such a strong popular vote anymore. But they still have control of the House and the Senate, and so yeah, we'll see what he can get done. But yeah, he's not president yet. So
Where do you sit in terms of this new upcoming this administration taking office in January? How does it what are your thoughts?
well, for one thing, I'm Canadian, so it's sort of a trying to be an objective observer. But everyone has emotions, everyone has feelings. We've seen Trump before in terms of how he affected Canada. His first acts in going in was to make arbitrary tariff. We got into a bit of a tariff scrape. And renegotiating NAFTA 2.0. Was NAFTA 2.0 much better? Marginally better for the U.S., I guess. Not marginally that bad for Canada, but it was a lot of. I guess the main thing with here is a lot of unnecessary creative destruction, and I think that's really how it just sort of typify what I'm expecting here. If you can believe half of what comes out of his mouth, and you've got Elon, trumpeting other things, and Vivek trumpeting things, there seems to be a lot of uncertainty as to exactly what is going to change, but change is certain. I mean, that's the thing. Elon has basically said change is painful, and they believe change is necessary. And I also think, just sort of you can take a look at what happened in Pennsylvania, I believe it was Butler, Pennsylvania, where he got shot, and he came out of it saying, "Look, I think I got saved for a reason." And so there's a bit of a, he's not really necessarily a religious type, but it feels like he says, I've got things to do this time around. It's not like I'm trying to stay around for another 4 years. I want to get shit done. So it sounds like, yeah, if he's saying he wants to do things, he's going to go full hold, no holds barred, do whatever he thinks he needs to do, and giving Elon the power to change government. And I think he honestly wants to push as many buttons as he can to try and get things. And it sounds like he's coming from the right place generally about wanting to make America more efficient. But in the process, and we can get into the weeds here if you want, but I think it's going to be extremely it's not a everyone wins scenario. There's going to be major winners and losers here, and as I said, the part of it is the uncertainty. And so if you take a look, even if he doesn't enact tariffs against Canada, the uncertainty that he's created, it's like, well, what does this mean? And so you got people that were thinking about making investments in certain industries. Now they go, well, I don't know how this is going to impact me or the industries I'm interested in, so maybe I'll just hold on. So ultimately, the first act here is it's going to be contributing to a slowdown in activity globally. And so, if you're looking at what's going on, China's already reacted. They've changed their stance from neutral to, completely, we've got to start looking at stimulus, and, monetary policy, which had been sort of loosened, is now going to be weak. They're going to dramatically try and weaken the renminbi. They're going to be stimulating, fiscal stimulus, which of course you've seen commodity prices react to that. So that's one impetus right there, is like people are expecting the need to stimulus because these actions or these proposed actions are seen as going to be very destabilizing and contractionary in terms of economic activity.
Yeah, well, and so you bring up a good point with the tariffs because this is a different government than when tariffs did make an impact. I don't know how positive it's going to be in America by imposing tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and abroad.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's again the question mark. So, and he's selected a new Treasury Secretary who's presumably well versed in macroeconomics. He's been a hedge fund manager, worked for Soros, so he understands how tariffs can and cannot work. But he's basically said if you put a tariff in, it just impacts where people allocate their spending, and that may or may not be true. If you put in a tariff in on steel, well, it's going to cost more to import steel, so people will be. His thought is, well, incentivize people to actually make steel in the U.S. But in the meantime, that's disruptive, and it will add to the cost of steel. Anyone that uses steel as an input to make other things. So you're going to have, costs raised, throughout the supply chain, which is inflationary. But it also may be job destruction because it's like, all these jobs that rely on cheap steel will now have to wait for U.S. production to make steel, and that could take. It depends. It's like, why did steel production leave the U.S.? Was it because workers were demanding too much and you could do it cheaper in China, or was it that the efficiency of the plants, the new plants in China were more efficient than the U.S.? But in any case, whatever the cause is, it's going to take a long time for the U.S. to come to some sort of ability to make that steel cheaper than their competitors. And as I said, if China is trying to devalue their currency, it's going to make it even harder for you to try and get efficient to fight that cheap steel that's coming in. So it's a cause and effect, and it's a law of unintended consequences. There's going to be a lot of adjustment, and it's not necessarily going to be a win for the U.S. initially anyway. And that's you can apply that to tariffs. You can apply that to the Doge department looking to increase efficiency by cutting government. It's you don't know exactly how that's going to turn out. It may turn out good in the end, but it will be very messy to get there.
Yeah, I want to talk about Doge, but I want to. I want to share some things with you about that. I've been getting shit because I'm a pessimist and I'm a doomer and I'm a whatever else people want to call me, black pill, whatever. I don't look at it like that. I look at it just being objective. And you know what? Who am I? The only one listening to me is you right now, and I didn't think Trump would win. So what do I know? I don't know anything. But first, regards to the tariffs, one, we import everything. We don't export anything. So how's that going to work? And again, I'm not an economist, but how will that work to impose all these tariffs when we have to have everything brought in to begin with?
Well, and that's just it. It's there, the U.S. has traditionally been it's a country with a lot of vast resources, and you know, the ability to self, um, you know, create, be able to access that was what would, built American industry up in the first place. It's like they were certainly weren't importing coal and iron in the 1800s to build up American industry. That was built in from U.S. directly. So U.S. has always been a bit of an insular economy, but as it grew, it was able to export its capital and invest in other countries. And that's how the U.S. became so dominant, is because basically the U.S. is an incredibly rich country in terms of natural resources. But as it got bigger and bigger and bigger, it started to do what any kind of, I hate to call it an empire, but really it replicated what the empires of old did. Was it you know ex- created subsidiaries in foreign countries and used those countries as supply points to bring resources to the U.S. The U.S. gradually became more and more reliant on foreign locations for its resources, and whether it be uh, there's certain crops that you can't grow in the U.S., so it makes sense you needed to import bananas from South America. But the the thing is now it's like, yeah, like bauxite. Yeah, and I'm sure most of the bauxite does not come from the U.S. It comes from other countries like Australia or wherever. I don't know what natural resources we might get from China, but I mean the fact is that the U.S. is, yeah, now very dependent on, it's for Canada, it's dependent on energy. U.S. is a huge with the shale revolution, the U.S. is now a net producer of oil, but traditionally they have relied on Canada and other places for their energy needs. So, and they still do to a large extent. I mean, we can talking about one interesting thing that happened this week was, Trump had made the comment about the 25% tariffs to Canada, and then we've had some of our politicians make some rather silly comments, like the Premier of Ontario just said, well, if they want to put tariffs on us, we won't ship our energy to them, and it's like Trump had a comment back, well, we're subsidizing the Canada. Well, that's all meaningless mumbo jumbo. I don't really understand where Trump thinks we're subsidizing the U.S. But the fact of the matter is that the Ontario premier was wrong. It's like, well, we're not going to sell our energy to you. Well, where are we going to sell our energy to? It's like, this is hydroelectric energy. A large part of it's coming from Quebec and Labrador, and it's like it has to be used in the North American grid. You can't export this energy to Europe. It's like you don't have a way of easily transporting this energy across the Atlantic Ocean. So you have to sell it to the U.S. So it's like there's all these kind of interlinkages that both sides are being lost in political rhetoric, and you really have to be kind of like putting your head in the sand to actually believe these silly comments that are going back and forth. But ultimately, as I said, tariffs will be disruptive, and it creates noise. And whether it's just a political nonsense, and you have bargaining going back and forth, and you have, the people that really love this kind of stuff is the news organ and mainstream media, because then they always have stories to write about. It's like, today Trump said this, and that means, the Canadian economy is projected to lose 5% of GDP over the next 5 years. It's like all these kind of mindless stories that, at the end of the day, it doesn't really capture what's going on. And the fact is, the U.S. and Canadian economies are very interlinked, especially in something like auto production. So having tariffs on steel is kind of self-defeating, because all you do is you raise the price of that. So if you're trying to divert consumption away from cars into something else, then yeah, let's put a tariff on steel. But of course, he's talking about a 25% tariff on everything. And that is, again, as you noted, because the U.S. is importing so much from Canada. Canada is a huge export country. We rely on the U.S. The U.S. is our major, export destination. So it would hurt the Canadian economy, but it would also hurt the U.S. economy, because prices of everything you buy from us would go up. And so how do but the other interesting part about this is not an economic reason for the tariffs. It's because Trump believes that Canada is a source of, fentanyl and illegal immigration. And, I've got a lot of Canadian friends that say, what the heck is he talking about? We don't have, the truth is that we do probably have issues with that. People come to the U.S., they try and get through Canada because we perceive to have easier onboarding. And in terms of fentanyl, Vancouver's a huge port, and we've had numerous cases where we found large busts of fentanyl supply. So the Chinese use Vancouver, they use Seattle, they use LA, they use Mexico to bring in these sort of the whatever the byproducts of fentanyl, and then they manufacture it in Canada and then ship it to the U.S. So it's certainly a case where he's not totally off base in terms of these concerns, whether using tariffs as a club to try and threaten changes. It's interesting. It's not, one thing is he's not business as usual here. It's like this is not something that's been done before, trying to use an economic policy to deal with a border issue. So in that sense, this is a reflective of Trump not being from the system. He's outside the normal system. So this is not something a normal politician would try. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a bad thing. It certainly woke people up. Again, you got the Ontario Premier all upset. And so, this is interesting whether the current Canadian federal government does something because, immediately Trudeau went down to Mar-a-Lago and to see Trump whether he gave assurances, yeah, we're going to do something about the border, or whether he just made noises about doing something. He doesn't do anything as his prime ministers want to do. It's all talk and no action. But we do have a federal election coming up in 6 months, so maybe that changes Canada's reaction. Maybe we do comply, or maybe Trump has to put the tariffs in. And as I said, then we go into the road of unintended consequences and all the cost impacts that may hurt both Americans and Canadians.
Yeah, I mean the back and forth between him and the Ontario Premier. It's just look where we are in a society today. I mean, just
Yeah.
it's unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. And you want to just byproduct of this when this whole thing happened. Canada said we're not the fentanyl problem; it's Mexico. Of course, then Mexico's prime minister said, "How dare you, Canada? Don't criticize it. We're doing all this." So then Trump's created this animosity between Canada and Mexico. It's bad enough we've got major issues with India, but now we've got this hubbub between Canada and Mexico because of this. And ultimately, that's always competition. Who is doing a better job at catering to Trump? So in that sense, again, like whatever you think about Trump, he's a survivor, and he's been able to manipulate people his entire career. So now he's manipulating Canada and US and Mexico to comply with his wishes. So in that sense, again, it's not something a normal politician might try. But the sense I get from him and Elon and everyone else involved this time around, this time it will be different. I don't think it'll be 2016. He's going to try a lot more new stuff, and he's going to just, again, I think he's on a mission. I think he wants to do something, and his legacy is going to be, I can't really, who knows what it's going to be, but I think he's really determined to roll the dice this time.
He is the most resilient son of a bitch I've ever seen.
Yeah,
I mean, whether you
yeah,
like him or hate him, and the other thing is, we're never going to see a phenomenon. He is a phenomenon.
yeah. Well, and ultimately, if you look what happened, it's like so many people can't. How can this guy have been considered candidate? How can he be the guy? How did he get elected again? It's like he's got a kind of charisma, and no one else in the Republican Party offered the chance to win again. And I don't understand. And same critique could be the Democrats actually. Why with such a active base, how come there's so few potential leaders on both sides that would people respond to? But they do respond to Trump. Some it may not be the traditional Republicans. Some would argue the Republican Party is dead and it's a new party. But the fact is, he is able to attract energy and votes, and that's what the Republicans needed here, and they got it. But yeah, he's not typical. And whether after he's gone, do we revert to the same old, or has the world changed? And we have, whatever the JD Vances of the world. And I guess that's one thing that a lot of people are concerned about is if, Trump either lasts his 4 years or, God forbid he dies before then. It's like, well, then we got JD Vance in, and JD Vance is a tool of Peter Thiel and all the Silicon Valley Republicans. So what does that mean? And how does that look? And people are scared of that. So I don't know if they should be or not, but that's where the sort of thought process is. It's like, yeah, this is grooming the world to be sort of a crypto, IT AI world, and Trump is just decided to bang open the doors to get us there, and then his successors will be the ones who set the stage going forward.
Yeah, and it's the whole JD Vance Peter Thiel connection, and I still have never got any clarity on it. How he met Peter Thiel, and then you go from meeting him to opening up a was it a private or private capital, private equity, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then you write a book that becomes a bestseller that gets made into a movie, and just it's just and I've gotten pushback from this, but I'm just like I'm just curious, like how do you meet a I mean how do you meet a billionaire and all of a sudden, man, it's the golden road, and
I think, yeah. I mean, I don't know anything about it, to be honest. My base case assumption is Peter Thiel has money. He's sort of like, what am I going to do with all this? Maybe I'll try to influence politics. A lot of these billionaires said, yeah, like, Soros. It's like, yeah, okay, I'm rich. I don't need any more money, but I want to do something with my life, so I'm going to try and influence things. So I assume Peter Thiel made the introduction or trying to find a way to get in, and that's where it came from.
well, and ultimately, to your point with AI, and as technology continues to advance and advance and advance, I think the noose is just going to get tightened. It's going to get tighter and tighter on the people because
Hmm.
they're not interested in relinquishing any type of control.
Oh yeah, they say it's like we're going to drain the swamp. We're going to change things for the better. It's like, but it's just replacing one form of slavery with another. And, I've had this debate online. People are talking to me about XRP versus Bitcoin, and the people that like Bitcoin say, well, it's a digital currency, whatever call you, if it's not a central bank digital currency, if they're using XRP, they can influence social control mechanisms, just like China has been doing. So, it's like, do you want to have your life controlled? Because, if they control your finances, they really have a huge lever on your behavior. So Bitcoin's immune from that. Well, is Bitcoin immune from that? It's like Bitcoin is now dominated by ETFs like BlackRock, and so ultimately, I'm not a huge IT guy, or I'm not a Bitcoin guy, but it seems to me that the original mission of Bitcoin is being corrupted slowly but surely. So, whether you're controlled by XRP or some sort of, you know, institutional firm like BlackRock who dominates Bitcoin, ultimately you're still, yeah, they're basically angling to control every aspect of your life. And, this is a side point. It's like BlackRock and all these other guys are buying up, private real estate. So, the intention is that people won't be able to afford houses, so they'll be forced to be renters. And so, therefore, these firms are buying up as much rental properties as possible, so that they can capitalize on that need. They're also buying up the single family houses, so there's not enough supply. And so, yeah, like it's gradually apparent that, whichever party you think, the people that talk about a uniparty are not that off base. I mean, whether the MAGA portion of the Republican Party is not the uniparty is another question. But if they're not, they're creating their own control mechanisms, as you noted. So.
Well, it's the amount of apartments that are being built around me where I live in Phoenix, it's unbelievable. I mean,
Yeah.
it's they putting it and they're putting them up so fast. I just I can't. I'm like, who's going to live in all these places? But it's like I think I'm watching 15-minute cities go up all around me.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, so just that image makes me think of China, which is exactly what China did. They over invested in their real estate. And the assumption was that they would have all their people come from the countries into the city. So, and everyone had said, well, Chinese citizens can't invest easily in their own markets or abroad. So they were forced to funnel most of their savings into property. So you had all these Chinese people throwing their money into development of apartment blocks in China, and then again, there wasn't enough people to actually live in them. And so there's a huge amount of these cities that are being now just demolished because the buildings were half finished. Meanwhile, the investors that put their money in lost everything. And so you wonder about why China's demand is slowing. It's like because everyone doesn't have any money to buy anything because they all blew their savings on property that overbought property. So yeah, like when you talk about Phoenix, and then my image is, well, the only reason you won't see that in Phoenix is because of the immigration story. And China, you always hear about China's population, but you don't really hear about people coming to China. I mean, sure, there's expats that go to work there, but really you don't have mass hundreds of thousands of people from India coming to China like you do in Canada and in the US, where you've got Latin America coming in. So I think what will happen is that, yeah, like those apartments will probably get filled up by workers that are needed. And ultimately, I mean, this is a complicated story, but it's a demographic story that we're seeing globally. And Elon keeps throwing this on X. It's like, the population replacement rate in industrialized countries is below 2, which means almost all industrial countries will have a demographic problem sooner or later. And, you've got Japan right now. Japan got around it by exporting all their production elsewhere. Germany is now in a process of not having enough workers, and you're seeing their companies having to raise wages, which is now increasing the cost of their products, which means they're not able to be as attractive. So they need to, the euro is dropping because the Germans can't export enough at previous prices because the cost of production has gone up. And that cost of production has gone up because they have labor costs are too high because there's not enough people to work. And so I think the U.S. is in getting there, but the immigration story will probably mitigate it. So yeah, you're gonna and yeah, like certain states, that's another diagram. Is California going to lose all the people and they're going to go to Southwest U.S. instead? That kind of thing. So, but on a whole, yeah, until we see some sort of change in demographics, I do worry that this will be a cause of global contraction. And again, it's like countries like the U.S. that have an immigration problem. Is it really an immigration problem? It is in the short term, and Canada, and I'm saying it's a short-term problem. It's a long-term solution. The problem is the government didn't think it out very well, and I don't think the government in the U.S. thought it out very well either. But I think that's why these houses in the U.S. are probably necessary. But yeah, like there's a very real chance they'll be empty for quite a while, and that means a lot of them will degrade in livability, and then you'll have to rebuild them. And it's just it's not a very efficient mechanism, but that's the way the market is right now. It's just rewarding when you have easy capital because of the central bank actions of the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Capital gets misallocated, and so yeah, you have Bitcoin at 100,000, and you have mass construction of apartments in a place that doesn't seem to need them right now. So
where's your level of concern at with what the Fed is doing? And there's got to be a Fed meeting next week, right?
yeah,
And they're talking quarter to a half point drop.
25, yeah, yeah. So my concern with the Fed goes back to 2008. Well, it goes back to 1971, to be honest. So, I when I was younger in the career, I wasn't a gold bug, but certainly the most pivotal event in history was when the U.S. went off the gold standard in 1971, because then it became a fiat currency, and so fiat currency is only as good as the central bank that is controlling the money supply. And if you have full faith that the central bank can control inflation, and therefore you're not expecting to see massive inflation, then you will be pretty confident about the value of your fiat currency, and you won't be inclined to look for an alternative. But in the 70s, of course, the OPEC crisis and the Vietnam War spiked inflation, and so the Fed in the early 80s had to raise rates dramatically, and that was painful. That was under Volcker, but that was successful in stamping out inflation. And so you had this period, for about 20, 30 years where it seemed like central banks were capable of keeping inflation under control, and there were other reasons behind that. It was, China was coming on the stage and offering an alternative and cheap production, and then also you had the tech revolution. Everything is suddenly more productive. You got massive increases in productivity because of the way people are adopting technology and able to do things faster and simpler than they were before. So that is what kept inflation under control. But as China got bigger and bigger and bigger and started to become a consumer, they started to not export deflation. They started to export inflation. And then you had COVID. But the reality is the monetary policies of the central banks, especially the Fed, Japan has been doing quantitative easing since the early 90s, and it really hasn't done anything other than inflate their national debt. Now you had the Fed decide to emulate them in 2008. So all of a sudden, the fiat currency situations where we believe that the central banks are being disciplined. Well, we're going to start printing money and buying assets to support the banks. And what you did is you increased the U.S. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from 1 trillion to 4 trillion in a span of a few years. And the whole point of time between 2012 and 2018 was we got to normalize the Fed's balance sheet by taking that excess liquidity out. And they got it from 4 trillion back down to I think 3.4 trillion. And then 2019 happened, the repo crisis in September 16, 2019. And then, okay, we got to stop tightening. And then within 6 months later, you had COVID. And so all of a sudden it's like, okay, totally forget about, normalizing the Fed balance sheet. We got to go for broke and spend and, issue as much liquidity as possible. And so, Fed rate goes to near zero, low for longer. Everyone in the U.S. is locking in huge amounts of debt. And so the debt had, since 2008, the debt stock in the U.S. had grown dramatically, and globally for that matter, because other countries emulated the U.S. And then you had a doubling or tripling or quadrupling down of that in 2020. So all of a sudden, the debt stock globally spikes dramatically, and people make a big thing about, oh, look at the federal debt, between 1910 and 1990, and since the 2000s, look at how fast the U.S. debt has gone up. And that's true, but it's not one party. It's been both parties. But it's also been a global phenomenon where low interest rates, because of the Fed and other central banks, have facilitated a massive, I hate this word, but a massive orgy of debt issuance. And everyone is basically living on debt. Balance sheets have exploded because of the ability to issue debt at low rates. Well, here's the problem. So when you do have inflation come back, because all of a sudden people have no faith that the Federal Reserve has the ability to control inflation anymore, as we saw in 2022, 2023. And so they raised rates at the fastest pace that they had done in history. And all of a sudden, it's like, you've got all these stories about U.S. regional banks going out of business because they can't get any funding because they had a duration mismatch where they were taking in short-term deposits at 5%, and they had been buying bonds that were paying 2% or 1%. So the value of their bonds dropped dramatically, and they can't get new financing because they don't have any assets, and they couldn't afford to pay 5% to deposit. So you had several regional banks in the U.S. go bam, and you have more that they had to set up a special pawn shop facility at the FDIC to handle it all. Um, that facility is supposedly closed, but they just transferred the risk to the Fed's discount window. So there's all these life support mechanisms that are happening because the Fed raised rates too fast. They lulled people into taking too much debt in 2020, 2021, and then they raised rates dramatically. And if you see what's happened to the actual, people like to point out the Fed central bank profits in general. It's like all central banks have taken massive losses because of this open, by buying bonds and issuing cash, they were buying bonds at the highest prices possible. And of course, when they raise rates, the prices of all those bonds they bought fell. So all the central banks are showing massive mark-to-market losses now. People are concerned about that. And I say, well, the thinking from the central banks is they'll hold these bonds to maturity, or they'll just wait till they have to cut rates, and they'll be able to sell these bonds back and mitigate the losses. But the issue is, if inflation is staying elevated, how do they do that? Because they can't really cut rates too fast, or inflation will creep higher. But so it's a question of how do you finance all this debt? All this debt is issued at, say, 0 or 1%, and now you're at 5% or 4%, and you've got longer term debt that's coming due, and you've got to reissue it. So the Fed solution, or Yellen, was to push all the issuance into the short end to 1 to 2 years, and not lock in 4% rates for 10 years. Well, now this year, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a huge amount of treasury bonds that need to be refinanced. I think it's 9 trillion or something like that. And so the Fed has to cut rates to make that more affordable, the refinancing. But that's why they opened with a 50 cut. And now it's like inflation has not really cooperated. It's not keep going down. It's stabilized. It looks like it's trending back up. So that's why the market's only expecting 25. And that's why Jay Powell has basically said, look, we're going to take it on a case by case basis. And, it creates an issue. It's like, so the one nice thing for the U.S. is everyone that had a 30-year mortgage in the U.S. was able to presumably lock in a very low 30-year rate. So there's not a, a rate reset risk in the U.S. in terms of the mortgages. So rates went up to 5%, but most mortgage holders were okay because they had a low long-term. That's not true in Canada. We got a problem this year in 2025 coming up because everyone locked in rates in 2020, and now in Canada it resets every 5 years. So we're going to have a major issue in rolling over those mortgages because everyone that had a 2% mortgage is now get a 5% mortgage. And that creates a huge problem in terms of managing consumption. How are we going to pay for all this? So that's why the Bank of Canada has been more aggressive in cutting rates, and they cut by 50 basis points this week. But the U.S. is only expected to cut 25 next week, which is why the Canadian dollar is going off a cliff right now. It's so it's cause and effect, but the U.S. at least has that advantage that the most homeowners should be okay. But it does create another problem all by itself because you've got a low mortgage. You can't really get out of that house. You're stuck in that gilded cage because if you sell your house to try and move to somewhere else, then you've got to take a new mortgage at a significantly higher rate. So the only way it makes sense is if the house you're selling is way more expensive than the house you're buying. And how are you going to do that? You've got to find a job that either pays way more than you're making now, or you make the same pay, but the house you're buying is much cheaper wherever you're going. And that's the issue is housing prices in the U.S. are not that out of whack. It's like, yeah, sure, houses in New York's, a condo in New York is still going to cost more than a house in Boise, but the job in Boise is not going to pay you what you're making in Manhattan. So how do that's the problem. People are stuck. And one of the biggest strengths of the U.S. economy historically has been, free movement of capital, free movement of human capital. People were able to change jobs, go from one state to another easily. And that's why the EU was formed to emulate what the U.S. strength had. So I can get a job. I'm in Italy, but I need to get a job. I can go to Germany and get a job. Uh, but if you're stuck in your house in New Jersey and the job that you want is in California, you can't easily do that. And this, yeah, I know we want to talk about Dodge, but this is one of the biggest problems with Elon. They're talking about cutting departments in Washington and forcing people to move. But if everyone's stuck in these long-term mortgages, how are you going to move? Even if they're okay with moving, they can't afford it. So anyway, that's a side problem. That is what the Fed has created, this big freaking time bomb. They have so much debt to roll over that they can't afford to do it at high rates. They have to cut rates, but that causes more inflation. So you're going to have, regardless of what happens, to avoid an economic collapse, they have to, because yeah, if okay, let's not cut rates. Well, look at what's happened already. The spent of money spent on interest payments on the U.S. federal government is now higher than military spending. So how can soon you're going to have to cut spending on Medicare or Social Security or whatever to pay interest. So you've got to lower the rates to be able to manage that interest rate expense. And so to do that, you have to accept that inflation is going to go up. The only solution to this is to have an AI productivity miracle, which I think is why AI is getting so much. If
AI, wait, Peter, say that again. An AI a solution is what?
Sorry, an AI productivity miracle. So I said one of the reasons why inflation went down in the 90s and 2000s is because tech basically enabled a lot of old ways of doing things to get replaced by a lot simpler, more efficient way, like email instead of letters. So you can pay an invoice electronically as opposed to sending a check. So that was a huge productivity miracle, and that kept inflation down. So if you want to fight inflation now, you need something to boost productivity. Like basically prices will chase goods. So if you're able to produce things faster and better, then the prices don't necessarily have to go up because you're creating cost savings. So you need something like AI to be able to make work that you're currently doing a lot more cheaper. So that's what the old emphasis on robots, and again, there's winners and losers in this, but overall the idea is if you can generate enough new positive growth to offset um, the money that's floating around, then you don't need to worry about inflation because the new productivity should reduce costs to reduce pressure on prices. But if you don't have that, if AI is a fake miracle, if it doesn't translate to productivity gains, then you're going to have prices go up. So that's where we're at, is like the Fed has to basically keep rates low because they can't afford to lock in the Treasury borrowing and not just the Treasury, everyone's got rate reset risk at some point. And a lot of the banks have like this problem where they've issued so much debt to corporate real estate, and the corporate real estate's not going to be able to pay it, so they've got to be able to finance these restructuring at relatively cheap rates. And so if they have to refinance at high rates, they can't extend favors to the corporate developers, and the corporate developers will just go bankrupt. So the issue is you have inflation or you have economic collapse, and that's where the Fed is at. And they created this problem, but the problem is that basically you lose trust in fiat, and that's why everyone is getting onto Bitcoin and crypto and gold and silver, is because the central banks have undermined their sole mandate, which is to safeguard the illusion that fiat is a solid currency. And if you don't have anything backing it, it's basically, yeah, the full faith of the US government. Well, people are going to lose faith in the US government if they don't control their spending. And that's the whole point about this whole problem. It's like the Fed has enabled the Treasury to issue crazy amounts of debt, and there's been no significant effort to try and stem that spending.
And it doesn't appear that they're very interested in curbing any of that as well. I mean, and this is what I think. And you correct me here, if you, but with the Fed and even just the debt, I mean, they'll just keep it going. I mean, they're
Yeah.
never going to stop.
Well, exactly. You need some sort of economic reset. And even if you do have a reset, there's no guarantee that, people will abide. Like politicians don't have the incentive right now to be good governance. Like you can see that everyone's in it for themselves. It's like, I'll trade on inside information, and there's no consequences to Nancy Pelosi doing that. So why?
She did break her
And
hip today, though, Peter.
oh yeah, she just broke her hip.
So
Yeah,
maybe that was the
maybe
consequence of it.
karma. Yeah, but I mean, it's like there seems to be very little consequence to being in it for yourself and government. And it's like this is nothing new in human history. I mean, this happened in Rome all the time. It's like people got elected to the Senate and they just used their power in the Senate to get rich. And ultimately we saw what happened. You had civil wars between rich people, and Caesar used the plebs as his sort of, I'm going to do right for the plebs, and the Senate does, well, no, you're upsetting the apple cart. Screw up. We're going to, you're an enemy of the state now, Caesar. Oh, well, okay, I'll bring my army in, and what do you think of that? So this is really where, like, if you want to talk about how things are like Rome, it's like Trump is appealing to the plebs, and the Democrats appear to be acting as the Senate. And yeah, we don't want the old ways to change. We like to be able to trade inside information and all this. And how dare you challenge the system, Trump? And whether the I don't want to get into the assassination stories, but it's like this is the thing. It's like there's a real battle here between two power groups, and ultimately both of them are rich, but one is pandering to the MAGA crowd, which could be seen as the plebs in Rome. So ultimately, there's a power struggle and hopefully not a civil war. But I mean, that's, the lesson from Rome is that ultimately you have an empire created, and the empire lasts a fair time, but it ultimately fails because empires always will fail at some point. And that's my issue is like all this stuff we talked about control earlier. It's like, yeah, it's one way of trying to generate some sort of autocracy, definitely the republic. And yeah, I mean, the politicians don't feel any consequence to change their behavior. And ultimately, the people get fed up and they look for someone that will change it or pretend to change it. And that's, to be honest, that's what I think what's happened right now.
Well, and they were not going to curb spending, and this is where the Doge. First of all, this Doge cracks me up for a few reasons.
Yeah.
The first one is the fact that we're supposed to be less dependent on government, so now we formed another agency to curb government spending. Like, don't you find that ironic?
Oh, yeah. Well, and that's always the thing. It's like, how do you fight something? Well, you must use the same tools as the thing you're fighting. And yeah, that whole Nietzsche quote is like, be careful when gazing into the abyss gazes back. So ultimately, no matter what you do here to fight corruption, you got to be corrupted. And the whole point is like, can we trust them to actually carry through with their supposed mandate of actually cutting the number of departments and making things more efficient? And this is where humans are.
Peter, let me add something to this. Wait, let me just interrupt you for a second, because this is what I'm talking about. And and I've talked about this a bunch. They're like, well, people are like, well, they're going to cut, people the work from home model. I go, okay. Are they going to touch Social Security? Are they going to touch Medicare and Medicaid? And this is where, to me, what it all comes down to is, and I've said this a bunch of times, so for people listening, I'm sorry to like repeat the same lines, but Peter hasn't heard it, so, and that's all I care about right now. I think Trump has the stones to do what needs to be done, what truly needs to be done. The problem is, I don't think anybody else does.
Hmm.
And, you go in there, even if you cut, I'd love to see FEMA get cut in this. Yeah, I'd love to see it. What
Hmm.
is that going to do to the bottom line? That's what, a $35 billion department? That's nothing. It's
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
They're not
Yeah.
going to touch Social Security. They're not going to touch Medicare and Medicaid. These politicians,
Which are, yeah, 85% of spending or whatever. Yeah.
they're not going to do that.
Yeah. Well, that's like you argue this is just for show and they're just going to make piecemeal. I think there's some real anger that's like, yeah, we're going to dismantle the IRS or we're going to dismantle the FDIC. It's like, you know, I think that that satisfies emotion. If there's anger at the federal government, there's anger at the swamp. It's like, yeah, we look at it. We decimated. We took away, half the departments. Well, yeah, if those departments were only, whatever, 10% of the overall spending, it's like, okay, what is that really significant? But oh, look, we did this. So you could say and that's I think the whole point. And it's so complicated. Just like the tariffs, whatever they do here is not going to be simple and easy. It doesn't matter if it's a small department or a big department. You can't, everyone has to go back to work or you're fired. Okay, well, what if the people that you're going to fire are actually the ones that are the most productive? So, what if people are actually more productive working from home than they are in the office? And that's the thing. It's like, so you're not really doing anything except making it more unproductive. Or then, yeah, like I said, we're going to force people we're in DC. This department is now located in uh, Little Rock or whatever. It's like we're gonna create jobs in a Republican state and take them out of DC. It's like, well, if the people that again, the whole mortgage problem is one thing, but whatever. It's like I don't want to go to Little Rock. Well, what if the guy that doesn't want to go to Little Rock is the guy that's a knowledge expert and and is the guy needed to teach people how to use this system and platform this in Little Rock. You won't have a transfer of knowledge. You're going to have to make it worth his while, and it's all disruptive. So what I think is going to happen is, regardless of what they do, it's a lot of noise and uncertainty and energy. It's contractionary. It's contractionary because it's going to slow down activity. Regardless of whether you think the government does anything, if they do something, it's going to slow down because there's going to be so much uncertainty and chaos created by this. Uh, and that's my thing. It's like the tariffs are contractionary because it's going to be chaos. This whole Doge thing is going to be contractionary. The Fed has to cut rates because the economy is going to implode otherwise. And let me get to the third pillar of this: the enforced deportation. So all these workers, the people come in, have been, oh, they're taking people's jobs. Okay, they're working for cheap. And yeah, like these people needed to eat, they needed to have clothes. This has stirred the U.S. economy. This has created demand effects in certain parts of the economy. So you're going to take all these people out of the economy and force to move them. Well, first of all, it's expensive to do this. You're going to spend huge amounts of money to locate these people and then throw them on a plane and throw them to wherever you're sending them. That's costly. But not only that, these people are no longer around, so the jobs they were doing are going to have to go up because there's not enough people to do them now. So yeah, we're going to get real Americans to do those jobs again if they want them, but the wages have to go up. And so it'll be costly that respect. And it's also okay. Then all of a sudden, hey, I was selling 500 chimichangas every week to these guys, and now they're gone, and no one wants the chimichangas. So my business is going to collapse. So there'll be people that get destroyed by this that have been catering to these new people, these new immigrants. So it's going to be contractionary up. So you have everything that Trump is proposing. This is what was stupid. When Trump got elected, the market reaction was, oh, it's inflationary. Yields have to go up. The dollar's going up. But reality, everything he's proposing is initially contractionary. It will be inflationary down the road, but in the first start, it's contractionary. And so you've got to have a massive implosion in the U.S. economy. So you have to have the Fed cut rates. And so it's like, yeah, I think they're going to go 25 next week, but I don't think they're done. The market is only pricing in 25. I think the Fed has to cut more. So to that effect, I think all central banks have to cut more because it's going to be globally contractionary. And again, China is already seeing this. And again, China is another soap opera story all by itself. I could waste 2 hours just talking about that. But everything is going to be contractionary because of the uncertainty created by all this mess. Um, if they were saying, oh, we get in January 20th, oh, guys, we're all just joking. It's going to be the same as, or we're just going to do minimal cuts. The damage has already been done, right? People delayed decisions, made allocations. I don't think he's going to be joking. I think they're going to try. Like whether you said they're going to cut Social Security or not, the
There's no way, Peter. Peter, there's no way.
yeah.
And let me just add, I'm going to cut you off here for a second because the mass deportation, that's another one of those things. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. I mean, okay, some of these criminals, yes, the ones that took over the apartment complex, and I keep referencing the movie New Jack City. You remember
Yeah,
that
yeah.
movie? Remember
Yeah.
Wesley Snipes about the building, the Carter? It
Yeah.
felt like I was watching a real life New Jack City when those gangs took in Colorado. Yeah,
Yeah.
those people will be gone. Will they close the border down to make all this illegal this illegal flow? Yeah, yes, I do. Yeah, but you're talking about 40 million plus people? They're going to be rounded up and put back to their origin countries. It's
Yeah,
never going to happen.
the cost is mind-boggling, right? It's like
Well,
no,
it's not even
yeah,
that. I mean, look at. Okay, let's just take a city. Tom Homan was talking about Chicago. No local politicians. First of all, some of these states and cities, quote unquote sanctuary cities, have already said they're not going to comply.
yeah,
Even still, you can have ICE go in and grab some of these people, but can you imagine when it hits the video, the like Twitter, like X?
yeah.
Oh, you're separating people. The general public is going to go nuts.
Well, exactly. And then again, you have the story. Well, the state governor said, yeah, we're not going to allow this. It's like, well, the federal government's coming in. It's like you start having like this civil war thing. It's like, oh, you're defying the federal government. You know, if enough states decide they're going to defy the federal government, it becomes a very serious issue. So yeah, no, it's totally implausible. I mean, so it said if it were to happen, it's completely contractionary. And but the whole idea, you know, it I tend to agree with you on the whole. It's like, but even if they do what the minor thing, it's still costly. It's still very expensive. And that's the thing. It's just no one has any clue how expensive this will be. And in terms of federal cuts, it's like, yeah, if we cancel your job, we're going to give you 2 year severance. So have you calculated how much that's going to cost? Yeah. So this thing, it's going to be, you're not going to, these cost savings, as any corporate restructuring, it's never clean and easy. I mean, if it's done right, it takes only a few years. But this is a massive, if you take him at his word, this is a massive undertaking that will not, oh, we'll be done in 18 months. Okay. This is the problem with Elon. It's like he's full of hyperbole, and
He wasn't
he's
even
not.
elected, Peter. Isn't
Yeah,
that funny
and he's not
too?
even elected. He's not official anything, right? Yeah, no, fair enough. But it's like this is. Do you take him at his record because he went into Twitter and cut 90% of the workforce, and I don't see a difference in. So it's like, yeah, he's got a bit of a track record there. But on the other hand, Twitter is not the U.S. government. So, and I've had a lot of people say, well, look, Silicon Valley was full of useless bodies anyway. Oh, I said, well, isn't that the federal government argument too? Is like they're full of useless bodies, but it's not. Like I've worked in government. It's like you may think people are not productive, but there are certain things that will not happen if the right people aren't there. So yeah, there's dead wood, and Canada's added so many government jobs in the last 10 years that I would suspect, yeah, there's probably some dead wood. But it's not like Twitter where you can cut 90% of the people and say, ha, I don't think it'll be that easy. So.
Well, but and again, nobody elected him. And how did he make his money? He made his money on government contracts.
Yes.
And now, I honest to God, man, like I'm not a bright guy, but like I feel like it's like okay, when COVID, I got a package with a mask in it that somebody had given to me. It said right on the package, this does not prevent the coronavirus or COVID virus. It said
Yeah.
it on the package. I was
Yeah.
trying to explain this to people, and they're like, "You're wrong, you're wrong." I'm like, I didn't write this.
Says
It's
right there.
on the
Yeah.
package. And here
Yeah.
we are now. We're looking at Elon is Doge, and they're going to come in and clean it. I'm like, okay, this he made his money on government contracts.
Well, the ironic thing is, so I'm hearing all this talk about, oh, EV is more expensive than people thought. That Peter Zahan did a video I just watched this morning saying, oh, German car manufacturers bet too much on EV, and yet look at Tesla's stock price since the election. It's like up 100%, right? So it's like obviously they're expecting Tesla to benefit here, but why? Oh, because Elon is there. It's like, yeah, he's there's so much cynicism you can view this through, and So I sometimes view like these outrage comments from people on the left as like just, sore loser, but they do have a lot of accurate points too. It's like there's, you can be very cynical about the aims of people that are, claiming to be working for the best interests of the U.S. Everyone, again, it's like I'm talking about Rome. It's like Caesar was not like a saint. Caesar was very like he was giving out bonuses to his buddies and everything else. So, Elon's getting his bonuses, right? Elon put into like that's the other thing. So the Democrats are stupid because they went after the Musk and they basically said, look, we're gonna investigate you and all this stuff. It's like, okay, well, I guess if the Democrats win, I'm kind of screwed. So yeah, hell, I'm all in Trump. And it's like, $200 million later, Trump gets elected. It's like, and like again, I'm not American. I just look at this thing, and that was the stupidest political decision the Democratic Party could have done. It's like let's give the richest man in the world a reason to go support Trump. It's just insane. So now, yeah, Trump is going to pay him back, and it's going to be, you know, scratching at his back. Whether this is actually going to be, um, you know, carry through and do something good for the U.S. economy, I maybe you could just argue that the status quo wasn't working. And that's my only thing is like whatever they do, the status quo was inevitably bringing the U.S. down. So something has to happen. The question is, are you making it worse or better? And that's ultimately where I'm sitting here going. I hope that whether he's self-serving or not, I hope that they can do something good because ultimately where the U.S. goes the rest of the Western economy. So I'm not, it's like even this all the tariff crap between Canada and the U.S. It's like ultimately the U.S. succeeds, Canada benefits. So I want the U.S. to succeed, and I just don't know uh, how effective they will be. I'm hopeful. I guess that's where I'm leaving it.
I know I'm running out of time here with you, but I do, and it might not be enough time for you to respond. But in the state of Canada, and with your election coming up here in the first half of the year, how are you feeling about that in regards to the state of things and where it might go?
Yeah. Yeah. So the issue is that the Trump government, sorry, the Trudeau government has been in power as a coalition government the entire time. They never had majority. They basically have been a power sharing agreement with the National Democratic Party, which is a leftist party. So they haven't been ruling through mandate. They've been making a lot of decisions that a lot of Canadians don't agree with. And over time, as anything, fatigue for the ruling government happens, and it's getting worse and worse because a lot of the decisions that the Trudeau government have been making have been questionable, not necessarily common sense, and the budget's deficit spending has gone through the roof. And again, COVID and a lot, but it just feels like Canadians want to change. And they really are sick of Trudeau's antics, and like he was basically criticizing the U.S. the other day for electing, not electing a woman. It's like this is ridiculous. You shouldn't be commenting on that in the first place. But it's like, it's like I don't whether you're for a feminist or not. We've had a Canadian prime minister already, and it's like it's not necessarily like, you want the best person in the job. You don't want a DEI or DA whatever. But that's kind of a political spectrum right now is to support sort of opportunistic, redress the wrongs of the past and have, opportunity for people that haven't been in power before. But they have to be good for the country. And I think people are listening to Trudeau saying these things. It's like this is typifying exactly what's wrong with the Canadian government. It's like we're making decisions that aren't necessarily good for the country. It just sounds good. So he's full of sound bites that over time just people get more fed up. So the people that haven't been voting liberal in the last 10, 20 years are not going to vote liberal. And a lot of people that have been voting liberal or NDP for that matter have been decided, yeah, we're not going to go vote for this guy again. So you've seen sort of a lot of polls showing that even in Ontario, people are not going to vote Liberal. The issue is that the NDP has basically said we're not going to support the Liberals anymore, but they keep supporting them in confidence votes over the last few weeks. The reason is the NDP, there's two things. Cynical would say that the leader of the NDP needs to stay in power till the end of February because his pension becomes active. And he doesn't want to lose his pension. The more likely reason is that the NDP doesn't have any money. So if they were to go into political campaign, they would lose seats. because they couldn't afford to launch a campaign. So they want to stay in power with the Liberals as long as they can because they'll probably lose seats in the next election. So it's looking, to sum things up, it's looking for a conservative win in the next election. Whether that happens in 6 months or earlier is dependent on the NDP actually sustaining a conservative no confidence vote in the current government. That's where we're at. It's uncertain, but yeah, like Canada needs a change. Canada wants a change.
Peter, where can people find you?
So I am most often now on Twitter, Peter R. Hann 1. Don't ask me why there's a 1 there. It just seemed the right thing to do at the time. I'm also on LinkedIn, Peter Hann CFA.
What are your plans for the rest of the year and into next year?
Yeah, no, so I'm also on a platform called Slice where I give sort of market commentary, and it's a subscription service. I like to put in a lot more effort in that, grow that platform, and basically it'll have sort of my trade ideas, and I'll be putting in sort of paper trades to sort of demonstrate where I'm thinking in terms of trends. I'm mostly a macro guy, but I've been asked on Twitter so many times about individual stocks that I'm going to start focusing on sort of stocks that I hear about people want me to talk about. If subscribers want me to look into a particular stock situation, that's what I'm going to do. So my plan for the year is to be more proactive in terms of that. Yeah, and I use Twitter for a variety of reasons. I make joke posts. I comment on other people's posts, but I use Twitter X to keep track of sort of news as it happens, and then occasionally I post on LinkedIn for something that's a more substantial post that has a sort of a more macro long-term view.
Do you have any Coffee and Mike exclusives on where somebody might want to look at from a trend standpoint?
Not at the moment. I mean, I just put out a thing on last week on everything, basically saying dollar cat's going to 146. So that was my
What was
view.
it, Peter? What was it, Peter?
What's that?
What did you say?
What's that? I said I put out a post on LinkedIn, but I also put it on Twitter, basically saying dollar cat's going to 146. A more interesting post I put out on both of them was before Trump made his joke about Canada becoming a 50th state. I mentioned, look, the likelihood of Canada joining the U.S. is increasing every year. The more we have immigration, the traditional British mentality, crown Commonwealth member, I think it'll lose emphasis as the population changes. So that was one thing I put out before Trump made his joke. Didn't get a huge amount of play, but those are the kind of longer term thoughts I'm talking about. So.
Peter, as always, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming back on. I look forward to following your work and more conversations ahead.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Mic drop.